The Celestial Institute of Advanced Sciences occupied the entire northern hemisphere of Epsilon 7, a manufactured moon that hung in perfect geosynchronous orbit around a planet so thoroughly terraformed that its original designation had been replaced with Paradise 4, approximately 3,000 years ago. The institute represented the pinnacle of academic achievement in the galactic collective. A sprawling campus of crystalline spires and anti-gravity amphitheaters, where the best and brightest from 400 civilized worlds gathered to study everything from quantum consciousness to the philosophical implications of faster-than-light travel on deterministic causality. The key word there being civilized. The collective had very specific ideas about what constituted civilization, and those ideas generally involved a species having evolved past the barbaric necessities of physical violence, predation, and the consumption of actual biological matter for sustenance. The approximately 73 species that comprised the collective's academic elite had all independently evolved on worlds classified as Category 1 or 2 on the Habitability Comfort Index. Pleasant worlds. Worlds where the most dangerous native predator might be something roughly equivalent to an aggressive houseplant. And even then, only if you really provoked it. The student body at Celestial Institute reflected this peaceful heritage. 4-armed Velcarians, who communicated through bioluminescent color patterns and had never experienced what humans would call adrenaline, because their physiology simply didn't produce it. Gossamer-winged Therians, whose bone structure was so delicate that falling over represented a genuine medical emergency. Crystalline Gen, who existed in a state of perpetual philosophical contemplation and considered raising one's voice to be an act of unconscionable violence. Into this environment of aggressive pacifism and competitive intellectual superiority, the admissions committee had accepted exactly one human. His name was Marcus Webb, and by every measurable academic standard, he was devastatingly average. His test scores placed him in the 47th percentile. His essays on advanced temporal mechanics were described as serviceable, if uninspired, by the review board. His references from Earth's own academic institutions were polite but not effusive. He was, by all available metrics, the kind of student who would occupy the middle third of his cohort, graduate without particular distinction, and return to his homeworld to pursue a perfectly respectable career in some middling field of research. The collective's academic elite found this simultaneously hilarious and offensive. What they failed to appreciate in their crystalline towers and gravity-optional lecture halls was that Marcus Webb had been accepted not because of his academic excellence, but because of a bureaucratic checkbox. The collective's charter required representation from all member species in major institutions, and Earth had very recently been granted provisional membership after 3 centuries of aggressive lobbying and demonstration of its capacity for interstellar travel. Earth, Category 9, Deathworld, a designation that should have come with sirens and flashing warning lights. But the academic committee, in their infinite wisdom and complete detachment from practical reality, had reviewed Earth's classification and decided it was almost certainly an exaggeration. After all, how dangerous could a planet really be if it had produced a species capable of philosophical thought, mathematical reasoning, and the creation of what humans called reality television? Surely the Deathworld designation was simply the result of some overly cautious surveyor who had encountered a particularly aggressive weather pattern, or perhaps a larger-than-average predator. They had studied the reports, of course. Gravity at 1.0 g, which was frankly absurd. Atmospheric oxygen content that would be toxic to most species if sustained for more than a few hours. Temperature variations that spanned nearly 200 degrees, depending on geographical location and seasonal patterns. An extinction-level asteroid impact every 65 million years or so, which was just poor planetary planning. Native predators that included creatures capable of exerting bite forces measured in literal tons. Microorganisms so virulent that they could kill in days. Plants that produced chemical compounds specifically designed to cause pain and tissue damage. The committee had read all of this and decided Earth was probably just being dramatic. Marcus Webb arrived at Epsilon 7 on a standard transport, carrying 2 bags of personal belongings and wearing what appeared to be a pleasant expression of excited nervousness. He was, by human standards, entirely unremarkable in appearance. Average height, average build, with brown hair and brown eyes that suggested his genetic ancestry was sufficiently mixed that he could have plausibly originated from any of Earth's continental regions. He moved with the slightly careful gait of someone navigating a space with 20% less gravity than he was accustomed to, which the other students found vaguely amusing. "Look at it struggling with basic locomotion," remarked Zathros, a Valkyrian whose family lineage could be traced back 4,000 years through unbroken academic achievement. Zathros had 3 peer-reviewed publications before arriving at Celestial Institute, and he wanted everyone to know it. Frequently. I suppose we should expect this from a species that still experiences physical discomfort. Zathros's social circle, a carefully curated collection of the Institute's most aggressively elite students, found this observation delightful. There was Vexithal, a Therian whose wing patterns had won 3 competitions for their mathematical complexity. Kassarin, a Gen whose thought patterns were so refined that they could conduct entire conversations in philosophical constructs that took other species hours to parse. Nomek, a member of the trilaterally symmetric quarry whose species had never developed a word for violence, because the concept was so foreign to their biology that they literally couldn't conceive of it. This group had, within approximately 48 hours of Marcus's arrival, decided that he would serve as their entertainment for the academic cycle. It started small, as these things always do. Accidentally, providing him with nutritional paste formulated for Valkyrian biology, which would have caused him significant digestive distress if he hadn't noticed the labeling error. Submitting his assignments to the wrong department so they would be marked late. Spreading rumors through the student networks that humans were known to carry exotic pathogens that might jump species barriers, which resulted in several of his classmates requesting dormitory transfers. Marcus endured all of this with what appeared to be either infinite patience or complete obliviousness. It doesn't even defend itself, Vexthal observed, after an incident where they had convinced a junior faculty member that Marcus had plagiarized a paper, resulting in a humiliating 3-hour disciplinary hearing that eventually concluded he had done no such thing. I almost feel guilty. Almost. "Please," Zathros responded, his color patterns flickering in amusement. Guilt requires empathy, and empathy requires considering it a peer. It's a Deathworlder. It probably doesn't even understand it's being insulted. This revealed the fundamental misunderstanding at the core of their harassment campaign. They had looked at Earth's classification, seen the word Deathworld, and concluded that it meant the planet was dangerous to visit. They had somehow failed to consider what it meant for the things that lived there. The collective's Deathworld classification system was comprehensive and had been refined over thousands of years of exploration. Category 1 worlds were paradise gardens where evolution had proceeded along the gentlest possible paths. Category 5 worlds had weather. Category 7 worlds had actual predators, the kind that might eat you if you were very unlucky and very stupid. Category 9 worlds were designated as such, because they produced species that had survived environments so catastrophically hostile that their very existence represented a statistical improbability that should have been impossible. Earth had earned its Category 9 designation honestly. It was a planet where 99.9% of all species that had ever existed had gone extinct. It was a world where the dominant species had evolved not through peaceful adaptation to abundance, but through millions of years of desperate competition against thousands of creatures specifically evolved to kill them. It was a place where the atmosphere itself had once been poison, where ice ages arrived with geological regularity, where volcanic eruptions could block out the sun for years at a time, and where the food chain was less of a chain and more of a frenzied massacre with occasional pauses for reproduction. Humans had not merely survived Earth. They had conquered it so thoroughly that they had to invent ethics systems specifically to prevent themselves from accidentally exterminating everything else on the planet. But Zathros and his friends didn't know this. They saw Marcus's quiet demeanor and assumed it was weakness. They saw his preference for avoiding confrontation and assumed it was inability. They saw him eating alone in the commissary and assumed he was isolated rather than isolating. The harassment escalated. They hacked his environmental controls to make his dormitory uncomfortably warm, not realizing that humans considered 75 degrees Fahrenheit to be pleasantly cool. They scheduled him for laboratory sessions during what they believed were his sleep cycles, not understanding that humans could adapt their circadian rhythms with a flexibility that would have been considered a superpower to species that required exactly 12 hours of darkness in very specific wavelengths to achieve proper rest. They submitted a formal complaint that his presence in shared spaces created an atmosphere of potential danger, citing Earth's classification as evidence. That last one actually worked. The Institute's administration, forever concerned with maintaining the comfort of their most prestigious students, called Marcus in for a meeting with the Dean of Student Affairs, an ancient Gen named Philosopher Eternal Observation of Crystalline. Truth, who preferred to be called Phil, because the translation matrix took 20 minutes to render his full name. Mr. Webb, Phil began, his crystalline structure refracting the light in patterns that indicated deep concern. We've received complaints regarding your presence causing distress among the student body. Marcus sat in the chair that had been hastily modified to support his absurd bone density and said nothing, waiting. Several students have expressed concern that your homeworld's classification suggests you may pose a danger to others. While we certainly don't believe in species-based discrimination, we must consider the comfort of the broader community. I haven't touched anyone, Marcus said quietly. No, of course not. Nothing like that has been alleged. Phil's refractive patterns shifted to something approximating embarrassment. But perhaps you understand their concern. Earth is classified as quite dangerous. It's classified as dangerous to visit, Marcus corrected, not dangerous to leave. This was an important distinction that Phil, despite thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, completely failed to grasp. The meeting concluded with a formal warning placed in Marcus's file and a strong suggestion that he make more effort to appear non-threatening. He was advised to avoid sudden movements, to announce his presence when entering shared spaces, and to consider attending voluntary workshops on cross-species social integration. Zathros and his group considered this a tremendous victory. Did you hear? Vexithal's wings fluttered in excitement. They formally warned it. There's documentation now. If we keep pushing, they'll revoke its admission entirely. I still think we should do something more direct, Nomek suggested. The quarry's three-way symmetrical thinking allowed for creative problem-solving, but it also meant they sometimes had difficulty understanding when they had crossed lines that bilaterally symmetric species found obvious. Something that would prove it doesn't belong here. What did you have in mind? Kasarin's thought patterns flickered with interest. Nomek explained their idea, and the group's enthusiasm grew with each detail. The Celestial Institute maintained an extensive ecological research facility on the lower decks of Epsilon 7, a massive complex of environmentally controlled biomes that housed transplanted ecosystems from dozens of worlds. The facility served multiple purposes. It allowed xenobiologists to study alien environments without the expense of interstellar travel. It provided practical training grounds for students in the biological sciences, and it satisfied the collective's general obsession with cataloging and preserving everything they encountered. Security in the facility was sophisticated, but oriented toward preventing contamination between biomes and ensuring that nothing escaped into the station's general environment. It was not notably designed to prevent students from sealing other students inside the exhibits. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. There was a biome designated as Moderate Challenge Environment that housed the ecosystem of a Category 4 world. By the standards of the collective's pampered elite, this environment was genuinely dangerous. It contained predators, real ones, with actual teeth and claws and hunting behaviors. There were environmental hazards like uneven terrain and temperature variations. There were plants with defensive mechanisms that could cause irritation or mild toxicity. To any species from a Category 1 or 2 world, being trapped in this biome would be terrifying. It would be a nightmare scenario requiring immediate emergency response and probably psychological counseling afterward. Zathros' group planned to seal Marcus inside this biome during a scheduled class field trip, record his panic and desperate attempts to escape, and distribute the footage across the student networks. The humiliation would be total. He would almost certainly withdraw from the Institute, and they would have successfully purged their academic sanctuary of Deathworld contamination. They spent 2 weeks planning. They identified the access codes needed to override the biome's door controls. They positioned remote recording devices to capture every angle. They crafted a reason to separate Marcus from the rest of the class group once they entered the research facility. They even prepared a statement for the administration expressing their shock and concern that such a terrible accident had occurred, while their edited footage would clearly show that the human had wandered off on his own through his own negligence. It was foolproof. The field trip occurred on a standard station day, mid-cycle, when the artificial lighting was calibrated to simulate whatever passed for afternoon on Paradise 4. The xenobiology instructor, a pleasant Valkyrian named Professor Shalves, guided the class through the facility with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved their subject and failed to notice that several students were paying more attention to one particular human than to the fascinating examples of cross-species mutualism on display. And here we have the Moderate Challenge biome, Professor Shalves announced, their color patterns brightening with excitement. This environment represents a Category 4 world designated as Theta Garak 7. Notice the increased complexity of predator-prey relationships compared to the earlier exhibits. The viewing window looked into a surprisingly dense forest environment. Vegetation in shades of purple and deep blue created a canopy that filtered the artificial sunlight into shadows and scattered beams. Something large moved through the undergrowth, visible only as a disturbance in the foliage. The environmental readout displayed outside the biome showed temperature at 82 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity at 70%, and atmospheric composition that would require supplemental breathing apparatus for most species present. Could we get a closer look inside? Zathros asked with perfectly performed academic enthusiasm. Professor Shalves's patterns flickered with pleasure at the engagement. Of course, though we'll need to observe safety protocols. The environment isn't immediately dangerous. but we should remain near the entrance. The class filed into the biome through an airlock system designed to prevent cross-contamination. Most students accepted breathing apparatus from the equipment storage. Marcus, notably, declined. "I'll be fine," he said quietly when Professor Chalves expressed concern. "Remarkable adaptation," the professor observed, making a note on their datapad. "Human respiratory efficiency is quite impressive." The group moved perhaps 20 meters into the biome, staying clustered near the entrance as Professor Chalves pointed out various features of the ecosystem. The purple foliage, they explained, used a different photosynthetic molecule than Earth's chlorophyll. The predators native to this environment hunted by detecting electromagnetic signatures produced by nervous system activity. The temperature variations between the canopy and ground level created convection patterns that distributed spores from the reproductive organs of the largest vegetation. It was all very educational. Zathros gave the signal. Nomek, positioned near the back of the group, created a distraction by asking an elaborate question about the symbiotic relationship between certain fungi and the root structures of the dominant tree species. While Professor Chalves turned to address this with color patterns indicating delight at such intellectual curiosity, Vexthal subtly gestured for Marcus to look at something deeper in the forest. A flash of movement that suggested something interesting. Marcus, either genuinely curious or politely willing to engage, moved slightly away from the group. It was the opportunity they needed. Kassarin, whose crystalline structure interfaced directly with electronic systems, established a connection with the biome's door controls. The override code they had stolen from a compromised faculty account worked perfectly. The emergency lockdown engaged, designed to seal the biome in case of containment breach. Alarms should have sounded. Backup systems should have prevented lockdown while personnel were inside. Fail-safes should have engaged. They had disabled all of it. The doors sealed with a heavy mechanical sound that indicated serious engineering. Professor Chalves and the rest of the class found themselves on the safe side of that door. Marcus Webb found himself alone in a moderate challenge environment from a Category 4 world, surrounded by actual predators, with no breathing apparatus and no apparent means of escape. The plan had worked perfectly. "Oh no," Zathros said with impressively performed horror. "The system must have malfunctioned. Professor, we need to get him out of there." Through the viewing window, they could see Marcus standing very still in the forest environment, seeming to assess his situation. Professor Chalves's color patterns flashed through alarm and confusion. "This shouldn't be possible," the professor said, already working their datapad to contact facility security. "The safety interlocks should prevent this. Mr. Webb, can you hear me?" They activated the communication system. Marcus looked toward the viewing window, his expression unreadable through the tinted transparency. He raised one hand in what might have been acknowledgement, then turned back to examine the forest around him. "Don't panic," Professor Chalves called through the communication system. "Security is being notified. They'll have you out shortly. Just stay near the door and don't move. The predators are generally not aggressive if you don't trigger their hunting behaviors." Marcus didn't respond. He was looking up into the canopy, his head tilting slightly, as if tracking movement that others couldn't see. Zathros had activated the hidden recording devices. This was going to be perfect. They would capture every moment of the Deathworlder's fear, his panic, his desperate attempts to remain safe while clearly terrified. The footage would be devastating. What they actually captured was something else entirely. Marcus stood still for approximately 45 seconds, and during that time, something fundamental changed in his bearing. The careful, almost apologetic way he had carried himself in the Institute's corridors disappeared. The slight hunch to his shoulders, an unconscious accommodation to beings who found his full height intimidating, straightened. His face, which had maintained an expression of friendly openness since his arrival, went carefully neutral. He looked, quite suddenly, like a different person. Then he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes because the eyes are busy calculating trajectories and threat assessments. "Well," Marcus said quietly to himself, not knowing or not caring that multiple recording devices were capturing his words. "Guess we're doing this." He reached up and pulled off the light jacket he'd been wearing, the Institute's ambient temperature control having made it unnecessary in the climate-regulated corridors. In the humid warmth of the biome, he rolled up his sleeves with efficient movements. Then he bent down and picked up a rock. Not the rock nearest to him, not a random rock. He tested 3 different rocks before selecting one approximately the size of his fist, with a specific shape and heft. He tested its weight, adjusted his grip, and nodded slightly as if confirming something to himself. "What is it doing?" Vexistal whispered, wings fluttering nervously. Something moved in the underbrush to Marcus's left. Something large, judging by the displacement of the purple foliage. The predator native to this environment was called a Vrextal in the original surveyor's documentation, though the xenobiology department preferred the more academic designation ambulatory pursuit carnivore with electromagnetic sensory capability. It was roughly the size of an earth panther, with 6 legs that provided remarkable stability across uneven terrain, a sensory organ array that could detect the nervous system activity of potential prey from 30 meters away, and jaws designed to puncture the chitinous armor plating of the herbivores it typically hunted. It had detected Marcus's electromagnetic signature the moment he entered the biome, and had been slowly stalking closer. Confused by the unusual pattern, but recognizing it as something potentially edible. The Vrextal exploded from the undergrowth with the speed evolution had granted it for exactly this purpose. It crossed 8 meters in perhaps a second, claws extended, jaws open to deliver an immobilizing bite. Marcus was already moving, not away, toward. He stepped inside the creature's attack trajectory with timing that suggested he had tracked its approach through the undergrowth by sound alone. The rock in his hand, selected for weight and shape, swung in an arc that intersected with the Vrextal's skull, with a sound like a hammer hitting meat. The creature's momentum carried it past Marcus in a tumble of limbs and confusion. It crashed into the purple foliage, its electromagnetic senses scrambled by the impact, trying to understand what had just happened. Marcus didn't give it time to figure it out. He was on the creature before it could recover, and what happened next would require frame-by-frame analysis of the recording to fully appreciate. Human hands, evolved for tool manipulation and throwing accuracy, found purchase on the creature's sensory organs. Human arms, backed by muscle density designed to operate in Earth's gravity, applied leverage that something from a Category 4 world had no evolutionary answer for. Human body weight, absurd by the standards of most collective species, provided the kind of mass that made certain techniques effectively undefendable. The Vrextal stopped moving. Marcus stood up, breathing slightly harder than before but not winded. He looked down at the creature, then back toward the viewing window where approximately 30 students and 1 professor were staring in absolute silence. He waved again, that same casual gesture from earlier. Then he picked up his rock and walked deeper into the forest. "Oh," Nomek said in a very small voice. "Oh no. Get security here now. Professor Chalves said, their color patterns cycling through shades that indicated pure panic. Immediate emergency response. We have a situation. The problem was that Epsilon 7 security forces were calibrated for the kinds of emergencies that occurred in civilized space. They were trained to handle environmental breaches, equipment malfunctions, medical emergencies, and the occasional interpersonal dispute that got slightly heated. They were very good at their jobs by the standards of an academic research station orbiting a paradise world. They were not prepared for a Deathworlder doing Deathworld things. It took them 6 minutes to arrive at the ecological facility. This was actually excellent response time, and they would later be commended for it. But in those 6 minutes, Marcus Webb provided an education in human capability that the Celestial Institute would be processing for years. The biome contained 3 Vrextol as part of its ecosystem balance. Marcus encountered the second one approximately 2 minutes after dispatching the first. This encounter went faster, partly because Marcus was now familiar with the species' attack pattern, and partly because he had acquired better tools. The purple vegetation of Theta Garak 7 included several species with woody stems, dense enough to serve as clubs. Marcus had selected a branch approximately 1 meter in length with a natural curve that provided ideal leverage. When the second Vrextol charged, attracted by the electromagnetic signature of potential prey that had already killed one of its pack, it discovered that humans had been refining weapons technology for approximately 2 million years. The third Vrextol, either more intelligent or more cautious than its companions, attempted an ambush from the canopy. It dropped onto Marcus from above, a tactic that had served its species well against the typical prey on Theta Garak 7. Marcus, whose ancestors had been dodging things dropping from trees since before they figured out fire, heard it coming and rolled. The Vrextol hit the ground where he had been standing and learned firsthand about human persistence hunting adaptations when Marcus simply kept hitting it with the stick until it stopped moving. By the time security arrived with the override codes and emergency containment equipment, Marcus was sitting on a fallen log, looking slightly bored and definitely uninjured. The 3 Vrextol were not dead, because Marcus had, despite appearances, been carefully calibrating his force to incapacitate rather than kill. They were, however, deeply unconscious and would require veterinary attention. The security team, who had been briefed on the severity of the emergency by Professor Chalves's frantic communication, entered the biome in full hazard response gear. They found Marcus eating something he had picked from one of the purple plants. "Hey," he said pleasantly, "this is pretty good. Do you know if this stuff is toxic to Velcarians? Professor Chalves might enjoy it." The senior security officer, a gen named Observer of Protocols and Safety Measures, took several seconds to process the scene. "Are you?" they eventually managed. "Injured?" "No." "The predators are fine, mostly. They might have headaches." Marcus stood up, brushing purple pollen off his pants. "Can I go now? I have a quantum mechanics assignment due." The investigation that followed was swift and thorough and revealed several inconvenient truths. First, the door malfunction had not been a malfunction at all, but a deliberate override using stolen faculty credentials. The security audit trail led directly to Kasarin's crystalline structure, which had interfaced with the control system using an access code stolen from Professor Chalves's own account. Second, the hidden recording devices that Zathros's group had planted were discovered by the security sweep. These devices had captured not only Marcus's casual dismantling of the biome's predator population, but also footage from before the incident showing the group's planning and deliberate coordination. Third, when security reviewed Marcus Webb's admission file more carefully, including the Earth classification documentation that the academic committee had dismissed as exaggerated. They discovered that Category 9 Deathworlds were designated as such specifically because they produced species like humans. The full documentation made for disturbing reading. Humans had evolved in an environment where literally everything was trying to kill them. Their planet's gravity was high enough that every other species had to wear assistance equipment to avoid injury from their own body weight. Their atmospheric oxygen content was borderline toxic. Their temperature preferences were in ranges that most species considered emergency evacuation conditions. They had persistence hunted prey animals to death by simply following them until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. They had domesticated predator species and then selectively bred them into hundreds of variants for specific purposes. They had looked at the apex predators of their world and decided they would make good pets or entertainment or protein sources, depending on the species. Earth's evolutionary history was a horror show of extinction events and climate chaos and competition so fierce that the dominant strategy was encephalization. Just become smart enough to outthink the planet trying to kill you. And humans had done exactly that. The academic committee held an emergency session to discuss human admission policies. The Dean of Student Affairs submitted a formal apology to Marcus that was delivered with a level of diplomatic caution usually reserved for interspecies treaty negotiations. Several prominent xenobiologists requested permission to interview Marcus about human evolutionary adaptations. Requests he politely declined because he had assignments to complete. Zathros, Vexthal, Kasarin, and Nomek faced disciplinary hearings that resulted in academic suspension and, in Kasarin's case, criminal charges for unauthorized access to secure systems. The hearings were brief because the evidence was overwhelming and because all 4 students were still processing the psychological trauma of watching someone casually demolish what they considered terrifying predators. It just killed them. Vexthal kept repeating during their hearing, wings trembling. It picked up a rock and killed them. The creatures were not killed, the disciplinary board noted. They were incapacitated with remarkable precision. That's worse, Vexthal insisted. Don't you understand? It was holding back the entire time. In the institute, in classes, in the corridors. It's always been capable of that, and it was just choosing not to. What kind of species does that? The answer, which the collective was slowly coming to terms with, was the kind of species from a Category 9 Deathworld. Marcus completed the academic cycle with grades that remained stubbornly average. His papers were still serviceable but uninspired. His test scores still clustered around the 50th percentile. He made no particular effort to capitalize on his newfound reputation, ignored the xenobiologists requesting interviews, and continued eating alone in the commissary. But the space around him at the long tables was noticeably larger now. Students from civilized worlds who had never experienced actual danger in their entire evolutionary history had learned something important about the universe. There were species out there for whom violence wasn't an aberration, but a fundamental part of their existence. Species that carried the capacity for destruction in every movement, but chose, moment by moment, to do something else instead. Professor Chalvez, during a private conversation with Marcus several weeks after the incident, asked him something that had been bothering them. "Did you know?" the professor asked, color patterns carefully neutral. "When you entered the biome, did you know what they had planned?" Marcus considered this for a moment, looking out the observation window at the stars beyond Epsilon 7. "I knew something was going to happen eventually," he said finally. "People from safe worlds always test boundaries. They don't mean to be cruel. They just genuinely don't understand what they're poking." "And you simply waited?" Patience is a persistence predator trait, Marcus said with a slight smile. We're very good at waiting for the right moment. What would you have done if the situation had been genuinely dangerous? If the predators had been more capable? Marcus looked at the professor with an expression that was perfectly friendly and completely terrifying in its honesty. Professor, those things were about as dangerous as an earth house cat. If you want to see genuinely dangerous, you'd need to put me in a Category 7 environment. Maybe Category 8. But I don't think the Institute has one of those. Professor Chalves's color patterns cycled through several shades that had no precise translation, but generally conveyed existential horror. The semester continued. Students whispered when Marcus passed in the corridors, but they also started asking him questions in study groups. Carefully, respectful questions. Questions from people who had suddenly realized that the universe was much larger and much stranger than their civilized worlds had prepared them for. Questions about Earth, about human history, about what it meant to come from a place where survival was never guaranteed. Marcus answered when he felt like it and ignored them when he didn't, which was another very human trait. The ability to simply not care about social pressure when it became inconvenient. The collective's academic institutions gradually revised their admission policies regarding Deathworld species, not to exclude them, but to ensure that future students from civilized worlds understood exactly what they were sharing space with. Understanding, the administrators hoped, would prevent future incidents of catastrophically misjudged harassment. Zathros, after completing his suspension, submitted a thesis on predator-prey dynamics in high-stress evolutionary environments. It was surprisingly good, though Marcus never learned about it because he had blocked all communication from his former harassers and had no interest in their academic rehabilitation. Vexthal transferred to a different institution, one that didn't admit Deathworld species. Kasarin completed their criminal sentence and began advocating for better security protocols in academic environments, speaking frequently about the dangers of complacency in civilized space. Nomek simply withdrew from academic life entirely, choosing to return to their homeworld and pursue meditation practices designed to process trauma. The discovery that violence was a real thing that really happened had shattered several foundational assumptions about the universe. And Marcus Webb continued his studies, maintaining his thoroughly average performance, eating his meals alone, and doing absolutely nothing to either leverage or diminish his reputation as the Deathworlder, who had very politely reminded the Celestial Institute that civilization was a choice humans made, not a limitation they suffered from. The Institute's administration eventually commissioned a more detailed study of Earth's classification, resulting in a comprehensive report that included the following observation. Humans had evolved in an environment so hostile that their baseline stress response would be considered a psychiatric emergency in most collective species. Their capacity for violence was not an aberration, but a survival trait refined over millions of years. Their patience was literally the result of evolutionary selection for hunters who could track prey for days. Their ability to function in high-stress environments was so far beyond the collective norm that they barely registered conditions that would debilitate other species. The report concluded with a recommendation that future interaction with human students should be conducted with the understanding that humans were, by collective standards, utterly insane. They were a species that had looked at a planet actively trying to kill them and decided to stay. They had faced down megafauna with nothing but rocks and teamwork. They had survived ice ages and volcanic winters and asteroid impacts. They had competed with thousands of other species for resources and had won so thoroughly that they had to invent conservation ethics to prevent themselves from accidentally killing everything else. And now they were in space, walking among species that had never faced a real predator, asking polite questions in study groups and getting average grades on quantum mechanics exams. The collective was still processing what this meant. Marcus Webb graduated 3 cycles later with honors in theoretical physics. Not highest honors, not valedictorian, just regular honors. The kind awarded to students who performed competently in their field of study. He returned to Earth, accepted a research position at an academic institution in the North American sector, and proceeded to live a perfectly normal life by human standards. Back at the Celestial Institute, in the Ecological Research Facility's Moderate Challenge biome, there was now a small plaque near the entrance. It read, "Environmental Hazard Protocols updated following incident 7-4492. Note, Category 9 Deathworld species do not require emergency extraction from Category 4 environments. They require supervision to ensure they don't damage the exhibits." The plaque had been Professor Chalves's idea, installed with colors that indicated gentle humor but also profound respect. The Vrextal population in the biome had recovered nicely, though they now displayed unusual wariness around bipedal motion patterns, a learned behavior that xenobiologists found fascinating. And somewhere in the student networks of the Celestial Institute, the footage of Marcus Webb casually dismantling 3 predators with a rock and a stick continued to circulate, passed from cohort to cohort as a reminder that the universe was big and strange and full of species that had survived things that civilized minds could barely imagine. The humans, everyone agreed, were definitely one of those species. They looked harmless. They acted friendly. They got average grades and asked polite questions and respected social boundaries. Right up until they didn't. And then you remembered that they came from a Category 9 death world, and that every moment of patience was a choice they were making. And that civilization for humans wasn't a natural state, but an ongoing decision to be something other than what evolution had designed them to be. Which was, depending on your perspective, either the most comforting or most terrifying thing about them.